when people, maybe even including yourself, think conceptually of what a genius is, they normally associate it with the characteristic of being intelligent, which is right, seeing as they are effectively synonymous, but rarely is a deeper question asked, which is, what are they intelligent at? And the theory I've had for a few years is relatively simple, and that is that I believe that more people who consider themselves to be ordinary have the capacity for extraordinary intelligence and may even possess it without even realizing. So let's get straight into it. So, the best place to start is by actually defining what a genius is. Now, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, the definition of a genius is an exceptionally intelligent or talented person, or one with exceptional skill in a particular area of art, science, etc. So, this means this is a person with remarkably deep knowledge in an area. But we can actually take this a step further, because there is a quality of what we consider across all geniuses that geniuses just have that hasn't got anything to do with that person per se, and more to do with that field or society as a whole. And that is, and this is a common trait between all geniuses, and that is that they are considered as a scarce resource. The reason why there's massive value on geniuses is because, well, if we follow, economic supply and demand dynamics, we can say that as the supply of a resource shrinks, the demand for that goes up. Obviously, that's not the case in every situation, but in this case, it is. So, in this sort of situation, you've got these people who are considered as geniuses, and they are just very, very scarce, which is why they are valued very highly. And the reason why I mention that is because in the book by Peter Thiel, 0 to 1, which in my opinion is definitely one of the best books ever written, he talks about this notion of competition, and that the best companies are able to escape competition through monopolization of a specific niche. Similarly, if we look at people who we consider by society at large to be of that genius moniker or genius caliber, these people are basically just experts in a field with very little or no real competition at all. So we can then define genius as we can then define a person who is a genius as a person with deep knowledge in a very niche area or very specific area with few occupants. So, what does that actually mean in regards to being a genius? That means to effectively become a genius, you need to find a very specific field to gather deep expertise in with few occupants. And one way to do that is to basically to pick a field and just continuously niche down until you are the only competitor within that niche. Now, the risk behind that is that if you are the only competitor, what you say goes, and you may be completely closing yourself off to alternative perspectives. But which may be a good thing, may be a bad thing. You'll have to decide that. Now, we also have to consider the fact that audiences play a big role in determining genius. So, an example I'll give you is when I was in university. So I was actually, I'll give you a couple of examples. So when I was 16, I was really, really into like Marvel and stuff, and I wanted to build me and a friend of mine. We wanted to build Jarvis, right? Like anyone who's ever watched Iron Man, the first thing that you want to do is, first thing if you're really like into tech is, I want to build Jarvis because that just looks super cool, or build like the Iron Man suit or something, right? Despite the fact that me and him didn't really have much programming experience, like I had a little bit from like GCSE days, but nothing enough to like really, really build something meaningful. And then a few years later, like I actually, during COVID, I got really interested. I'd always been interested in like mathematics as a whole. I'd always loved it. I'd always enjoyed it. And I got really curious about the mathematics behind AI and how that works. So like I learned, and I still remember a couple of things. So like things like k-nearest numbers or learning vector quantizations, all of that sort of thing, all of those sorts of topics. And there weren't very many people that I knew, if any, to be honest, that were actually really into that. And the view counts on the things that I had been, the courses that I had taken were really, really low. So, in theory, had I decided to go down that whole sort of like rabbit hole, in theory, if I decided to specialize in that in terms of research, before this was years before it was obviously popular, because it's massively popular now, then yes, in theory, you could have considered me to be a genius in AI, even though I just knew very specific information that most people didn't, right? And an example where I'll talk about this in terms of a public audience is, like, I remember when I was in university, I was with my housemates and we were all just sort of like talking and stuff, and the conversation went like deep, like kind of later into the evening, into the night, and it was just getting into a deeper conversation. And part of that conversation ended up steering into an area of interest that I had, which was philosophy and psychology, and the niche subset within that was regarding the philosophy and psychology regarding self-improvement, right, and stoicism, because I'd been really, really interested in Stoic philosophy in general. And I remember, like, one of the girls there, she was like, yeah, you are probably the smartest person I've ever met. You are a genius, right? And then someone else said, yeah, I think he might be an evil genius, right? They said that as a joke. Now, the reason why the audience matters and why I share that story isn't just to say, oh, look, I'm some super smart guy. That's not the reason why. The reason why they had perceived me to be a genius is because I had presented information about a very specific area of interest that I had in front of an audience who were laymen's, effectively, because they didn't have they didn't really have much of a deeper insight into that, right? Now, had I presented the exact same things in front of a group that actually knew what I was talking about, actually had the same breadth of knowledge, they wouldn't have considered me to be a genius. They would have considered me to be a normal person that had the same level of interests. So the audience that you're presenting in front of to be considered a genius does matter. And one thing I want to emphasize as well is that I believe that being a genius, a quote unquote genius, doesn't necessarily have to be from an academic and intellectual aspect either, right? So, for example, if we look at football, right, a lot of people would consider players like Lionel Messi and Cristiano Ronaldo to be geniuses. Now, you might make the argument saying that, hey, people are just taking the word genius and being fast and loose with it, right? Perhaps that's true, right? But I don't believe that to be the actual case. I actually would consider them to be a genius at football. And you might say, wait a minute, hold on, pause. Football is a very competitive sport. So yes, they might have had deep knowledge. The area might have been niche. It might have been football, right? And if you want to go even depth, then you could talk about their positions individually within on the pitch. But there's a lot of people who are competitors. So how does that work? And we can think of a concept that Tony Robbins has spoken about, or at least where I had learned this sort of philosophical concept from, and that is this idea that people are rewarded in public for what they have been practicing in private for years. So I would actually argue that Messi and Ronaldo did have a small niche, but were not there by conscious decision, but by circumstance, right? By force of nature. See, now they are considered, to be the best in the world, and by and large, they are the biggest names in the sport. But when they started out, that wasn't the case, and they weren't even the best in their country. They had to start by being the best in their neighborhood, then being the best in their city, then being the best in their country, then being the best in other countries, and then, after being the best in other countries, were they then considered to be the best in the world. And if you look at like companies in a similar way, companies will expand into horizontal and vertical markets after being the best. So take Google, for example. They started out in search, right? There was only a handful of players in search, and Google became the best at it over several years. They were the most. They absolutely had the largest market. Like, they actually took over the market by storm. They monopolized it. And then Paul Buchheit creates what we now know as Gmail, which is a different market, right? Which started many years after they were the best search engine. So it's also important to recognize that being a genius isn't just confined to just one thing. You have to be the best, and then you can expand. But it's also really important to recognize that genius is not always the same thing as publicity. But that said, publicity does provide that broader societal perception, like I described earlier with my story with my housemates, and how Google are effectively appear to be geniuses. After dominating one specific thing, if you do have publicity, it can provide a very broad societal perception that you are a genius, and in certain situations, that can actually be more important, especially if we look at it from a market perspective. So, for example, let's say you have two products. Product number one, they have a really, really solid product, and they have an absolute killer marketing and sales engine. Product two, they have an exceptional product, even better than product one, but they don't have any real sales or marketing to back it up. What will often happen is that product one will end up beating product two in terms of market share because of a publicity behind it, because of the audiences that they're going after. Now, the real way to sort of separate yourself from the crowd almost and be a genius, well, is to basically dominate the competitive landscape. And there's two ways to do this. The first way is you need to just continuously get more and more specific into an area where you are effectively the only competition. Or option two is to have a unique insight when competition is present. So in business in general, you consider this as the unique selling point or the economic moat. So for example, if you look at, say, Einstein's theory of relativity, one of the things you'll notice about if you look at his paper, he's made zero references to any other academic literature, which is huge. It's massive. It's massive in the world of academia, because you have to reference other people's work, but he didn't. Or you could even look at someone like Napoleon, who had a unique edge because he didn't stick to just a really rigid approach to war, right? He didn't create brand new strategies. He took strategies that he thought would work, but he was very fluid with his movements, right? And that was unique. So, yes, you can absolutely, zone into one specific thing and dominate that. That can work. But sometimes genius can also just require truly 0 to 1 thinking, right? Where you're not reasoning from analogy, you're reasoning from first principles, which is a whole different video for a different day. And essentially, the simple tutorial basically for you then is this. Step one is to pick an area that you're interested in. Let's say physics, for example. Then to pick a subset within that field. And then take a look at the competitive landscape and niche down further until there are very few occupants or you are the only occupant, right? And I'm just thinking of Big Bang Theory here for a second. So physics, you got string theory, and then within string theory there's probably something else that's related to physics that's very specific. So after you've picked a field, have a look at the competitive landscape, make sure that you are, that there are very few occupants within that space. And when you've picked the area that you want to specialize in, dominate it by either finding a unique insight or becoming the only competitor in the game by niching down further. And finally, after you've become the best after many painstaking years, you can try to go into neighboring verticals, or you can go horizontal for publicity in an attempt to become more like a polymath. Now, this is all assuming that you agree with my definition of what a genius is to be true. If you disagree with that, then none of this actually works. And one final note I'll quickly leave you with is, if you want to find out how many occupants are within that sort of area of expertise, you need to be in the right circles. So earlier I talked about, presenting in front of the right audience, right? So you can spend time becoming a specialist in something, and you can present it in front of a layman audience, and you will give the general perception that you are a genius, right, or an expert within that field. But the real test is actually when you can present in front of people who are effectively within your immediate competitive landscape, or maybe just one rung away, right? So if you're in the situation where you've managed to find one very specific thing where there's nobody talking about, where no one's looking at, no one's talking about, and then you go like a layer out, and you can find all the other people, and then blow their minds, then you know that that's how you can sort of examine the landscape. And that's pretty much it. That's effectively how you can become a genius, in theory, and why I believe that most people have the capacity for that, and they don't realize it, because a lot of people have interests, right? A lot of people have very specific interests, and if they decided to pursue an interest in depth in front of the right audiences as well, they might actually become genius. They might actually unlock that last bit of. They might actually unlock like a massive untapped potential of becoming a genius, because that's all a genius really is, at least according to this belief and the definition that I've sort of constructed with you today. Also, you might be thinking, wait, hold on. Let's say everybody looks at this video hypothetically, and then everyone decides to specialize in a specific field, and then everybody is considered a genius. Doesn't that sort of it doesn't, like, by the laws of economics, surely, that if we have an increase of supply of what we would consider as a genius, then the demand and the perceived value of geniuses goes down? I would say no, and here's why. So, firstly, again, if we go back to the original argument, it's not about being a genius, it's about being a genius at what? Being intelligent at what? And even then, there's going to be so let's say there's 8 billion people and every single one of them hypothetically was a genius, therefore the word genius is now effectively redundant, right? But assuming you agree with this definition, you have very specific subsets of interests, and then even there you have more specific interests, and over time as well, new interests develop. As knowledge expands, you're going to end up creating new markets, you're going to create new interests, create new fields, in which case there is an endless sort of supply almost. And you might say, okay, but what about the general terminology of a genius? Well, here's why I still don't believe that to be actually devalued. People today have actually been, like, you can make the argument that people are generally using the word genius very loosely, and that maybe that word has gone down a bit. But when you actually meet a genius, or like you speak to someone, you're like, wow, this person is actually like a genius, or you think about someone who is like considered as a genius, you would generally look at them and think you generally know that they're a genius, right? Despite the fact that it's already seen as something that's already widely accepted, if that makes sense. So what I mean by that is, let's say you've got like your friend, right? It's just a guy who's just really, really specifically interested in something, and you think he's a genius, and then you think about Elon Musk as well. You go, oh, okay, that's a genius. So there's different levels to it as well, right? So my answer is, the answer to is this going to be devalued? No. In fact, I think the value will go up, because firstly, it's not going to be devalued because of the fact there's different specific interests. But the second reason is because of the fact that when you have all of these people who are going to be then considered as geniuses hypothetically, what happens to the bar? It goes up, right? The standard goes up, right? Because if everyone's competing against each other, the standard for what exceptional is goes up. It doesn't go down. The only time the standard actually goes down is when the supply of these geniuses goes down. So that's why I don't believe that if hypothetically everyone in the world, not going to happen, right? Very, very 0.000000001% chance that ever happening. I don't think that it's going to be an issue. So that's my answer to that specific question. Now, if you've watched this video to this point, I've left a link in the description to an unlisted YouTube video. Now, if you are selling B2B products or services and you want to be a genius with your outbound and getting people into the door to take a look at what you're offering, take a look at that video and I hope it helps you. Thanks.